I didn't go up that mountain to survive anything. I went up there to disappear. 3 weeks after my divorce finalized, I packed the back of my father's old Tacoma with canned food, a camp stove, 2 propane tanks, a sleeping bag rated for 20 below, and a bottle of Jameson I told myself I wouldn't open until the second night. The cabin belonged to my Uncle Ray, dead since 2019. A one-room timber structure he'd built by hand in the summer of 1987 on a ridgeline outside Silverton, Colorado. Elevation 9,200 feet. No cell service, no plumbing. A gravity-fed spring line that froze every January, and a wood-burning stove that hadn't been serviced since the Obama administration. It was perfect. I wanted silence. I wanted the kind of cold that makes your thoughts slow down enough to catch. My name is Joel Brannick. I'm 36 years old. I was a high school history teacher in Grand Junction until the district eliminated my position during budget reallocations. That was March. Karen filed in April. By the time I loaded that truck in late October, I had nothing anchoring me to the valley floor except inertia. The drive up took 4 hours. The last 11 miles were unpaved switchbacks through dense spruce forest, the kind of road that punishes you for every distracted second. I arrived just before dusk. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by a natural amphitheater of rock and timber, facing west toward a valley that dropped away like the earth had simply given up. The door was swollen shut from moisture. I had to shoulder it open. Inside, everything smelled like dust and pine resin and old wool. A mouse had died somewhere behind the wall. I could smell it, sweet and wrong. I opened both windows, started a fire, and sat on the edge of the cot Uncle Ray had bolted to the floor. I told myself I'd stay 2 weeks, maybe 3. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped. Quiet mornings, coffee boiled on the camp stove, long hikes along the ridge where the only sound was wind moving through the tops of the trees like something breathing. I split wood. I read a water-stained copy of Cormac McCarthy's The Crossing that I found wedged behind the stove. I drank the Jameson on the second night, as planned, and watched the stars through the window glass, and felt, for the first time in months, something close to stillness. On the third morning, I heard a helicopter. That wasn't unusual. Search and rescue ran operations in the San Juans regularly, especially in autumn when hunters got careless. But this helicopter was low, dangerously low. It passed over the ridgeline twice, the rotor wash shaking the spruce canopy hard enough that I could hear branches snapping. I stepped outside and watched it bank south toward Silverton. Then I heard a second one. And a third. By noon, I counted 7 helicopters, all military profile, black fuselages without visible markings. I tried the truck radio, static across every FM band. AM gave me a fragment, a woman's voice, clipped and mechanical, repeating coordinates I didn't recognize. Then a phrase I did recognize. Civilian evacuation corridor remains closed north of Durango. Do not attempt travel on Highway 550. Repeat. The signal collapsed. I stood in the clearing with the truck door open, staring at the radio like it owed me something. Then a sound reached me from the valley below. Not helicopters, not wind. It was something I'd never heard before and have never been able to describe accurately since. A wailing that seemed to come from dozens of sources simultaneously, rising from the tree line 1,000 feet below my elevation, rolling up the slope like smoke. It wasn't animal. It wasn't mechanical. It carried a pitch of human anguish stretched past the point of recognition, as though vocal cords were being used for a purpose they were never designed to serve. I went back inside the cabin. I closed the door. I slid the bolt. That was October 29th. I didn't know it yet, but the world I'd driven away from had already ended. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life up to that point. I say up to that point because the scale of what constitutes a long stretch of fear would be redefined for me many times in the weeks that followed. I rationed my attention. I checked the windows every 15 minutes. I kept the fire low to minimize smoke. An instinct I couldn't have explained logically at the time, but which I now credit with keeping me alive through that first night. The wailing from the valley came and went in waves. Sometimes it would cease entirely for 20 or 30 minutes, and the silence that replaced it was worse, because silence in those mountains had always meant safety, and now it meant something was choosing not to make noise. At approximately 8 p.m., I heard footsteps on the gravel path leading to the cabin. They were wrong. I knew that immediately. The rhythm was off. Too fast, then stopping, then fast again, like someone learning to walk for the second time. I moved to the window on the south wall, the one facing the tree line, and pressed my face against the cold glass. A man was standing at the edge of the clearing. He was wearing what looked like a hunter's orange vest over a dark flannel shirt. His head was tilted at an angle that no conscious person would hold voluntarily, chin nearly touching his left shoulder, as though his neck had partially surrendered to gravity. He was standing completely still. I could see the vapor of his breath in the cold air, rapid and shallow, like a dog panting. I recognized the vest. I'd seen it 2 days earlier, draped over the passenger seat of a parked Jeep Wrangler at the trailhead 11 miles down the mountain. There had been a cooler beside the Jeep, a bow case, a bumper sticker that read, "Hunt hard, pray harder." The man in the orange vest took one step toward the cabin, then another. The steps had that same broken cadence, lurch, pause, lurch. His arms hung at his sides without swinging. His fingers were spread wide, rigid, as though electricity were running through his hands. I backed away from the window and pressed myself against the far wall, next to the stove. My heartbeat was so loud in my own skull that I was afraid he could hear it through the timber. He reached the cabin wall. I heard his palm press flat against the exterior, a soft, deliberate sound, like someone testing whether a surface was real. Then he dragged his hand along the wood, slowly, from the south wall toward the door. The scraping was deliberate and exploratory, fingernails catching on the rough-cut planks. He stopped at the door. I could hear his breathing on the other side, that rapid, shallow rhythm that didn't sound like exhaustion. It sounded like excitement. The door handle rattled. Once, twice. The bolt held. Uncle Ray had mounted that bolt with half-inch lag screws into a solid Douglas fir frame. I silently thanked the dead man. The rattling stopped. The breathing continued for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably 2. Then the footsteps moved away, not back toward the tree line, but around the cabin. He circled the entire structure. I tracked him by sound alone. South wall, west wall, north wall, east wall, back to the door. Another rattle, another pause. Then he made a sound. Not the wailing from the valley. Something quieter. A clicking. Rapid, rhythmic clicking from deep in his throat, like a language stripped of every vowel. It rose in pitch, held, then stopped abruptly. From the tree line, something answered. The same clicking, but from 2 distinct sources, separated by maybe 30 yards. I sank to the floor. I put my back against the stove, still warm from the fire I'd banked, and pulled the sleeping bag over my legs, and pressed both hands flat against the floorboards to stop them from shaking. The clicking continued outside for another hour. It moved. It shifted positions. It circled. By midnight, the sounds retreated downslope, and the mountain went silent again. I did not sleep. I did not even close my eyes. Dawn arrived slowly, the way it does at altitude in late October. A grudging gray that seeps across the sky without warmth or promise. I hadn't moved from the floor. My back ached from the stove's iron edge. My hands were stiff. The fire had gone cold sometime around 4 a.m., and I hadn't dared rebuild it because rebuilding it meant making noise. When the light was strong enough to see by, I crawled to the south window and looked out. The clearing was empty, but the ground wasn't undisturbed. I could see tracks in the frost, footprints in the thin white layer that had settled overnight. They circled the cabin in the pattern I'd mapped by sound. A complete loop, repeated 3 times based on the overlapping impressions. Near the tree line, the tracks multiplied. 3 distinct sets of prints converging from different directions, meeting roughly where I'd estimated the answering clicks had originated. I studied those tracks from behind the glass for a long time. What bothered me most wasn't their presence. It was their depth. The impressions were too deep for casual walking, even on soft ground. These were the marks of someone pressing down with unnatural force on every step, as though their legs were locked straight at the knee, and all their weight drove down through the heel with each impact. I made a decision. I needed information, and the only source of information I had was the truck radio. I checked every window twice, scanned the tree line for movement, then unbolted the door and stepped outside. The air hit me like a slap. 28 degrees, maybe colder. My breath came in white bursts. I crossed the clearing to the Tacoma in 12 seconds, climbed inside, and turned the ignition to accessory. The AM band was still mostly dead. I scanned slowly, lingering on every frequency that offered even a whisper of signal. At 8:70 a.m., I caught something. A man's voice, exhausted and flat, broadcasting what sounded like a looped emergency bulletin from a station in Farmington, New Mexico. Confirmed outbreak in La Plata, San Juan, and Montezuma counties. The pathogen is transmitted through fluid contact, blood, saliva, open wound exposure. Incubation ranges from 90 minutes to 6 hours. Infected individuals exhibit extreme aggression, loss of higher cognitive function, and heightened auditory response. Do not engage. Do not approach. FEMA staging areas have been established at. The signal dissolved into static. I held the dial steady, waiting for the loop to restart. It didn't. The frequency went dead. I sat in the truck cab with the engine off, processing. Pathogen, outbreak. Transmission through fluid contact. 3 counties deep into infection. Military helicopters without markings. Civilian corridors closed. I looked at the fuel gauge. Half a tank. Enough to reach Silverton, maybe Durango if the road was clear. But the broadcast had specifically warned against Highway 550. And the only road off this mountain connected to 550 within 4 miles of the trailhead. I could drive down and risk whatever was happening in the valley. Or I could stay at 9,200 feet with a bolted door, a wood stove, and enough canned food for maybe 10 days if I rationed carefully. I chose the mountain. Looking back now, I understand that this decision was not purely rational. Part of me, a large part, didn't want to go back to a world that had already rejected me before it collapsed. The mountain felt like mine. The cabin felt like mine. The silence, even the new and frightening silence, felt like something I could own. Going down meant rejoining a civilization I'd already been expelled from. And doing so at the exact moment that civilization was tearing itself apart seemed like a particularly cruel joke. So I stayed. I went back inside. I rebuilt the fire. I inventoried my supplies. 41 cans of food, mostly beans and soup. 2 propane tanks. A hatchet, a folding knife, a flashlight with extra batteries. 11 gallons of water in jugs, plus the spring line if it held. No firearms. I'd never owned one. That last fact would haunt me within 72 hours. On October 31st, 2 days after I first heard the wailing, a woman walked into my clearing at midday carrying a child on her back. I saw her from the north window. She came up the slope through the spruce, from the direction opposite the main trail, which meant she'd bushwhacked through dense forest for God knows how long. She was maybe 30 years old, dark hair pulled back, wearing a Gore-Tex shell that was too big for her, and hiking boots that were caked with mud past the ankles. The child, a girl, 4 or 5, was strapped to her back with what looked like a bed sheet knotted across the woman's chest. The girl's face was buried in her mother's neck. The woman stopped at the edge of the clearing. She stared at the cabin. She stared at the smoke coming from the chimney. Then she called out, "Please, I can see the smoke. I know someone's in there. My daughter hasn't eaten since yesterday." Her voice was hoarse, not the broken, clicking sound of the infected, just human exhaustion pushed past the point of dignity. I opened the door. Her name was Mara Espinosa. Her daughter was Lily. They'd been at a rental cabin 6 miles south and 2,000 feet lower when everything started. Mara's husband, Diego, had driven down to Silverton for supplies on the morning of October 28th. He never came back. By nightfall, Mara heard the wailing. By the next morning, she saw the first infected person stumble through their property. An elderly man wearing bedroom slippers, his jaw hanging slack, his eyes tracking her with a focus that she described as mechanical. She packed what she could carry, strapped Lily to her back, and went uphill. Altitude seemed safer. The infected, she'd noticed, moved more slowly on steep terrain. Their coordination degraded with elevation gain, as though the reduced oxygen affected whatever was driving them more severely than it affected healthy lungs. "They don't climb well," she said, sitting on the cabin floor with Lily in her lap, eating cold beans directly from the can with a spoon I gave her. Below 8,000 feet, they're fast. Terrifyingly fast. But up here, they stumble. They lose direction. I watched one try to follow me up a scree field, and it fell 4 times in 50 yards. This was the first tactical information I received, and it confirmed my instinct to stay high. I filed it away like currency. "Your husband," I said carefully. "Is there any chance?" "No." She cut me off without emotion. "The road to Silverton goes through a canyon. I could see the canyon from our cabin with binoculars. By the 29th, there were dozens of them on the road, walking, not going anywhere specific, just walking. If Diego drove into that, he didn't drive out." Lily hadn't spoken. She sat in her mother's lap, eyes open and fixed on the wall, thumb in her mouth. She didn't look injured. She looked emptied. A child from whom the expectation of safety had been surgically removed. I gave them the cot. I slept on the floor beside the stove. That night, with 3 of us inside and the fire stoked properly, the cabin felt almost warm. Mara told me everything she knew, and I organized it into a mental framework that replaced my ignorance with something marginally more useful. The infection moved fast. Towns were overrun within hours, not days. The military had established a perimeter somewhere south of Durango, but was struggling to hold it. Cell networks crashed on the first day. The infected were drawn primarily to sound. Gunfire, engines, screaming. They could detect noise from considerable distances, especially at night when the air carried sound more efficiently across the mountain terrain. They don't hunt by sight as much during the day, Mara said. But they hear everything. Every branch you snap, every word you raise above a whisper. We lowered our voices instinctively. Outside, the mountain held its breath. In the morning, I would begin fortifying the cabin. But that night, the simple presence of another adult in the room was enough. I wasn't alone anymore, and that changed the math of survival in ways I was only beginning to calculate. Fortification, when you have no nails, no lumber supply, and no power tools, is an exercise in creative desperation. What I had was the hatchet, the forest, and time, though the latter felt increasingly borrowed. On November 1st, I began cutting saplings from the north edge of the clearing, choosing the straightest young spruce I could find, each about 3 inches in diameter. I trimmed them to 6-foot lengths, sharpened one end, and drove them into the ground at an outward angle around the cabin's perimeter, creating a crude chevaux de frise, a term I remembered from a unit on Civil War fieldworks I'd taught 3 years earlier. The irony of battlefield history becoming survival practice was not lost on me. Mara helped. She was stronger than she looked. While I cut and sharpened, she hauled and planted, working in focused silence while Lily sat inside the cabin with the door cracked, watching us through the gap. We communicated in low tones, conscious of Mara's warning about sound. The work was slow. By midday, we'd completed a quarter of the perimeter, maybe 15 stakes covering the southern approach from the tree line. During a water break, Mara sat on a stump and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from anyone in a long time, evaluation without judgment. "You're a teacher," she said. It wasn't a question. I told her the previous night. Was. "You're thinking about this like a lesson plan. Steps, sequence, objectives. Is that a problem?" "No, it's useful. But the infected don't follow lesson plans." She was right, and the correction was delivered without cruelty. Mara was an ER nurse at Mercy Medical Center in Durango. She'd spent 11 years watching chaos arrive on gurneys and had developed an instinct for the gap between planning and reality. Her clinical precision would prove more valuable than any stake I drove into that frozen ground. That afternoon, she examined Lily in the daylight by the window. The girl still hadn't spoken. Mara moved through the examination with professional detachment, checking pupils, palpating lymph nodes, inspecting skin for any break or abrasion that might indicate contact. "She's okay," Mara said quietly, though the way she said it, releasing the words like she'd been holding breath for days, told me she'd been terrified of finding something different. "She's in shock, psychological withdrawal. She saw things on the hike up that no child should process." "What did she see?" Mara shook her head once, and I didn't press. We finished the southern perimeter by late afternoon and started on the western side. The stakes wouldn't stop anything determined, but they'd slow an approach and create noise. Anything brushing through them would snap wood and alert us. I angled them outward at 45 degrees, spacing them close enough that a body couldn't pass between them without contact. As dusk approached, I made another trip to the truck radio. The Farmington station was gone, completely dead on 870 AM. But I found a new signal, faint and drifting, on 1240 AM. A woman's voice, different from the earlier broadcast, speaking with the careful diction of someone reading prepared text under extreme stress. Confirmed cases now reported in every county in southwestern Colorado. The governor has declared martial law. Interstate 25 is closed between Trinidad and Colorado Springs. Military units are engaged in containment operations near Pueblo. Civilian casualties are. The number is not being released at this time. If you are in an isolated location with supplies, remain in place. Do not attempt to reach populated areas. Repeat, remain in place. I turned off the radio and sat in the truck, watching the light fade behind the western peaks. The sky was the color of a bruise, purple and gold and swollen. Somewhere below the tree line, in the valley I could no longer see, the clicking started again. Not wailing this time, just the clicking, rhythmic and patient, like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't yet identify. I went inside. I bolted the door. I checked every window. Mara was sitting with Lily, braiding the girl's hair by firelight, humming something so quietly I could barely hear it. That small sound, a mother humming to her child, was the last purely gentle thing I would hear for 11 days. November 3rd brought the first test of our defenses, and it came not from the infected, but from two men named Garrett and Paul. They arrived from the main trail in early morning, moving loudly enough that I heard them from 200 yards. Boots on gravel, voices at conversational volume, the sound of something metallic banging against a pack frame with each step. Every principle of noise discipline that Mara and I had been observing was being violated with casual confidence. I watched them from the window. Garrett was tall, mid-40s, with a gray beard and the deliberate posture of someone accustomed to physical authority. He wore a camouflage jacket and carried a bolt-action rifle slung across his back. Paul was younger, maybe 25, wiry, with nervous eyes that never settled on one point. He carried a shotgun in both hands, barrel pointed vaguely forward. They stopped at the stake perimeter and stared at it. "Someone's here," Garrett said, loud enough that I could hear him clearly through the closed window. I opened the door and stepped out, not because I trusted them, but because two armed men discovering a barricaded cabin would make assumptions I didn't want them to make. "Morning," I said. Garrett studied me the way a contractor studies a building, assessing load-bearing capacity. "You alone?" "Does it matter?" "It does if we're deciding whether this place can hold more people." The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and established several things. Garrett Holt was a retired corrections officer from Montrose. Paul Devon was his neighbor's son, a community college dropout who'd been working at a gas station when the outbreak hit. They'd driven south from Montrose toward Silverton, hoping to reach Garrett's hunting camp, but found the road blocked by abandoned vehicles near Red Mountain Pass. They'd continued on foot for 2 days, sleeping in shifts, and had killed 3 infected people along the way. "Killed" was Garrett's word. He used it without inflection. "The rifle works," he said, answering a question I hadn't asked. "Center mass puts them down. They don't get back up from a heart shot. Head is faster, but center mass is reliable if you're not a marksman." He looked at the cabin, the stakes, the thin line of smoke from the chimney. "How much food do you have?" "Enough for the people already inside." "There's more than you." I didn't respond. Garrett nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering a trade. You've got shelter and elevation. I've got weapons and ammunition. 60 rounds for the rifle. 20 shells for the 12 gauge. In this new economy, that makes me the richest man on the mountain." Mara appeared in the doorway. She looked at Garrett's rifle, then at Paul's shotgun, then at me. Something passed between us. Not agreement, but a shared recognition that the calculus had changed. 2 guns represented a defensive capability, I couldn't replicate with sharpened sticks. "Come in," I said. That decision was the correct one tactically, and the first fracture in my authority over a space I had begun to consider mine. I see that now, with the perfect and useless clarity of hindsight. Garrett entered the cabin and immediately began reorganizing. He moved the canned goods from the shelf near the stove to a position beside the cot, where he could see them from the door. He counted every can, 37 remaining, and calculated ratios aloud. 4 adults, 1 child, 37 cans. If we eat twice a day, that's roughly 4 days. We need to forage or we starve. "I was planning to ration more conservatively," I said. "Your plan assumed 2 adults and a kid. The math changed when we walked in." He wasn't wrong, but the ease with which he assumed command, the speed of it, the naturalness, told me that Garrett Holt was not a man who distinguished between leadership and control. In a corrections facility, the distinction doesn't matter. In a one-room cabin at 9,200 feet, with the dead learning to climb, the distinction would eventually mean everything. Paul sat in the corner, cradling the shotgun, saying nothing. Lily stared at him from across the room with an expression that wasn't fear. It was recognition. The night of November 4th dismantled every assumption we had built about safety at altitude. Mara's observation, that the infected climbed poorly, that elevation degraded their coordination, had been accurate when she made it. What none of us understood was that the infection adapted. Whatever pathogen was rewriting neural pathways in its hosts was not static. It was learning, and it learned fast. At approximately 2 a.m., I was on watch. Garrett had established a rotation, himself and me in 4-hour shifts, with Mara taking a shorter middle shift because she insisted, and Garrett didn't argue with someone whose medical skills might mean the difference between a treatable wound and sepsis. I was seated by the south window, the one with the widest view of the clearing, wrapped in a wool blanket with the flashlight off. The clicking began at the tree line. Not one source this time. I counted at least 6, maybe 8, spaced in a rough semicircle along the southern and western edges of the clearing. They'd never approached from multiple directions simultaneously before. The pattern was different, coordinated. I woke Garrett with a hand on his shoulder. He came alert instantly, a prison guard's reflex, and rolled off the cot with the rifle already in his hands. He moved to the opposite window and listened. "They're surrounding us," he whispered. "They've done that before. Circled and left. Listen to the spacing. That's not random movement. They're holding positions." He was right. The clicking sources weren't drifting. Each point of sound remained fixed, maintaining its position in the arc. They were establishing a perimeter. Our perimeter mirrored back at us. The first one hit the stakes at 2:14 a.m. I heard the snap of a sapling breaking, not bending, breaking, and then rapid footsteps crossing the gap between the tree line and the cabin wall. The impact against the exterior was enormous. The entire structure shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. Lily screamed. The first sound she'd made in days, a piercing, involuntary shriek that seemed to electrify the air outside. The response was immediate. Every clicking source went silent simultaneously, replaced by that wailing I'd heard from the valley on the first day. But close now, impossibly close, coming from throats just beyond the walls. And then they all charged at once. The cabin became a drum. Fists and bodies struck the walls from every direction. The door shook in its frame. The bolt held. But the frame itself groaned as the wood flexed under impacts that no single human body should have been able to produce. A hand smashed through the south window. Pale fingers grasping at the air inside, clutching at the curtain Mara had hung from a piece of paracord. Garrett swung the rifle butt into the reaching arm, and I heard bones break. But the hand didn't withdraw. It kept grasping, the fingers opening and closing mechanically, indifferent to the fractured radius beneath the skin. Mara pulled Lily into the corner farthest from any window and covered her daughter's body with her own. Paul was on his feet with the shotgun raised, but his hands were shaking so badly the barrel traced wild circles in the air. "Don't fire inside," Garrett ordered. "The sound will pull every infected for miles." He grabbed the hatchet from beside the stove and drove the blade into the wrist of the reaching hand. The arm withdrew. Dark fluid splattered across the windowsill, not bright arterial red, but something thicker, slower, carrying a smell like iron and vinegar. The assault continued for 47 minutes. I know the exact duration because Mara counted. She sat in that corner with her daughter beneath her and counted seconds, converting them to minutes in her head, giving herself a task that imposed order on chaos. Later, she told me it was a technique she used during mass casualty events in the ER. Count the time, own the time, refuse to let the crisis dictate your internal clock. At 3:01 a.m., they stopped. Not gradually, all at once. The wailing cut off. The impacts ceased. The silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that my ears rang with its absence. They had retreated. But the cabin wall bore their testimony. Splintered planks, a broken window, handprints in that dark, wrong-smelling blood. They had come at altitude. They had coordinated. They had adapted. The rules were changing faster than we could learn them. Morning revealed the full scope of the damage, and it was worse than the darkness had let us believe. The south window was destroyed. The frame cracked, the remaining glass jagged and useless. 3 planks on the western wall had been partially torn loose, leaving gaps wide enough to fit a hand through. The stake perimeter was devastated. Over half the saplings on the southern approach had been snapped or uprooted completely. And the door frame, the one I'd trusted with my life based on Uncle Ray's craftsmanship, had a visible crack running vertically through the left jamb. One more assault of that intensity, and the frame would fail. The bolt would hold, but it would hold nothing. The wood around it would simply come apart. Garrett assessed the damage with clinical efficiency while I stood in the clearing cataloging the footprints. The frost told a comprehensive story. At least 12 individuals had participated in the assault. Their tracks converged from downslope, but split into that semicircular formation approximately 80 yards from the cabin, which meant the coordination began before they could see the structure. They were organizing in the forest, in the dark, without visible communication. "We can't take another night like that," Garrett said, standing beside the cracked door frame and running his thumb along the split wood. "This place isn't defensible." It held. Barely. And they'll come harder next time. They tested us. That's what last night was. A test. I wanted to reject the implication that the infected were capable of strategic thinking, of probe and assess tactics. But the evidence was pressed into the frost at my feet. They hadn't committed their full force to any single point of attack. They'd distributed pressure evenly across all 4 walls. They'd identified the weakest entry point, the window, and focused effort there. This was not mindless aggression. This was something far more dangerous. "We need to move," Garrett said. "Move where? Down the mountain into worse?" "Not down, across. There's an old mining complex, the Vermilion Audit, about 3 miles northeast along the ridge. I've been there. Concrete and steel framing from the 1940s. 3 rooms, 1 entrance, walls they can't tear through with their hands. Mara emerged from the cabin with Lily on her hip. She'd heard everything. 3 miles exposed on a ridge in daylight, she said, with a child, through territory we know is occupied. The alternative is sitting in a wooden box waiting for them to improve their technique, Garrett replied. The argument that followed was the first real conflict among us, and it split along lines that would define every subsequent decision. Garrett wanted to move, aggressively, immediately, capitalizing on daylight when the infected were less coordinated. Mara wanted to reinforce and stay, patch the walls, board the window, preserve the known shelter. Paul said nothing. He sat on a rock near the truck with the shotgun across his knees, staring down slope at the tree line. I was the tiebreaker, and both of them looked at me with the expectation that I would choose their side. We reinforce today, I said. We prepare to move tomorrow. We patch the walls, board the window with planking from the truck bed, and pack everything portable. If tonight is worse, we leave at first light. If it's manageable, we stay and continue strengthening. It was a compromise. And like most compromises, it fully satisfied no one. Garrett's jaw tightened. Mara exhaled through her nose, but neither pushed back, because the plan contained enough of each position to make outright rejection unreasonable. We worked through the entire day. I stripped the wooden bedliner from the Tacoma, and Garrett cut it into sections to cover the south window. Mara collected rocks from the ridgeline. Heavy, flat stones she stacked against the base of the weakened western wall to add mass. Paul replaced the broken stakes, driving them deeper this time using a rock as a mallet. By dusk, the cabin was uglier but stronger. The window was sealed. The wall was buttressed. The perimeter was restored. We ate cold beans in near darkness, the fire reduced to coals to minimize light and sound. Nobody spoke about what would happen if the compromise failed. Everyone was thinking about it. They came again at 1:30 a.m. on November 5th, and Garrett was wrong about one thing and right about another. He was wrong that they'd come harder. They came smarter. No wailing, no clicking, no auditory warning of any kind. Paul was on watch and nearly missed them entirely. He spotted movement through a hairline gap between the truck bed planking and the window frame. A shadow shifting against the tree line that didn't match the wind pattern in the branches. He woke me with a whisper so faint, I felt the words more than heard them. They're out there. They're quiet. I moved to the gap and looked. The moonlight was strong, nearly full. The kind of cold silver illumination that turns a mountain clearing into a stage. I could see them. 7 figures standing motionless at the edge of the trees. Not circling, not approaching. Standing and watching the cabin with that terrible patience I was beginning to understand was their most frightening capability. They remained like that for over 2 hours. No movement, no sound. 7 silhouettes arranged in a loose line, facing the cabin, each one separated from the next by roughly 10 yards of darkness. Garrett watched from the opposite side and offered his interpretation in a voice barely above breath. They're waiting for us to make noise. Last time the kids screamed and they charged. They've connected sound with a confirmed target. Now they're waiting for confirmation before committing. We gave them nothing. 4 adults and 1 sleeping child held absolute silence for 2 hours and 17 minutes. My legs cramped. My bladder ached. I controlled my breathing to the point where I felt lightheaded. Mara had her hand over Lily's mouth, gently, maternally, but with purpose. At 3:45 a.m., one of the figures broke from the line and walked to the stake perimeter. It navigated between the stakes without touching them. without breaking a single one. It had observed the gaps in daylight. It had memorized the pattern. The figure reached the cabin wall and placed both palms flat against the repaired western section. It stood there, pressing as though measuring the resistance of the stone buttress Mara had built. Then it moved to the door. It didn't rattle the handle. It pressed against the door itself, testing the flex, finding the crack in the frame. Its fingers traced the split wood with the delicacy of a carpenter assessing a joint. Then it stepped back and returned to the tree line. The 7 figures remained for another 20 minutes, then withdrew down slope without a sound. Garrett set down the rifle and sat on the floor. In the moonlight through the gap, I could see something I hadn't seen on his face before. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recalibration. The expression of a man whose mental model has just been invalidated. "We leave at dawn," he said. No one disagreed. The morning was spent packing. We took everything we could carry. Remaining food distributed across 4 packs I fashioned from blankets and paracord, the propane, the stove, water, the hatchet, the knife, flashlights, batteries, and every piece of warm clothing available. Garrett carried the rifle and his pack. Paul carried the shotgun and a lighter load because his stamina was uncertain. Mara carried Lily on her back in the sheet harness and a pack across her front. I carried the heaviest load, the tools, the propane, the bulk of the food. Before we left, I stood in the doorway and looked back at the cabin. Uncle Ray's cabin. The place I'd come to disappear. The stove was cold, the cot was bare, mouse bones still somewhere in the wall. A copy of The Crossing on the floor beside a sleeping bag I was leaving behind, because weight is currency and sentimentality is debt. Mara touched my arm. "Joel." I turned away. We stepped into the clearing. The sun was low and the air was crystalline, and the mountain looked exactly as it had on the day I'd arrived. Indifferent, enormous, beautiful in the way that only things which don't care whether you survive can be beautiful. We moved northeast along the ridge. Behind us, the cabin stood empty with its door open. I never saw it again. The traverse was 3 miles. Garrett estimated 90 minutes. It took us 5 hours. The ridge was narrow in places, sometimes no more than 6 feet across, with steep drops on both sides falling away into dense timber. The trail, if it could be called that, was a game path worn by elk and mule deer, barely visible under the accumulation of dead needles and early snow. We moved in single file. Garrett on point, then me, then Mara with Lily, then Paul covering the rear. The formation was Garrett's design, and it was sound. Firepower front and back, non-combatants in the center, heaviest packs in the middle where the path was most established. For the first mile, the mountain cooperated. Clear sight lines across the open ridge. No timber close enough to conceal an approach. Wind from the west carrying our sound away from the valley where the concentration of infected was highest. The only noise was boots on stone and the rhythmic creak of pack straps. Lily broke her silence on that traverse. Not with words, but with a gesture so small I almost missed it. As we crossed a section where the ridge widened into a shallow alpine meadow, she lifted her head from Mara's shoulder and pointed east toward a cluster of rocks where a pika sat motionless in the morning sun, its tiny body a gray comma against the granite. Lily pointed, and her finger held steady, and she looked at the animal with the first expression I'd seen on her face that wasn't blankness. It was interest. Not joy, that was too far away still, but the faintest pulse of engagement with a world she'd withdrawn from. Mara saw it too. She slowed her step just slightly, letting Lily watch the Pika for an extra moment before we moved past. She didn't comment on it, but I saw her hand tighten on the sheet harness across her chest. And I knew what she was holding on to wasn't just her daughter's weight. The trouble began at the second mile. The ridge descended into a saddle, a low point between two high points where the terrain forced us through a band of timber roughly 300 yards wide. Dense spruce, limited visibility. The game path narrowed to nothing, and we were pushing through branches that grabbed at our packs and scraped across our faces. Garrett raised a fist, the military stop signal, and we froze. Ahead, in a small natural clearing within the timber band, a body lay face down on the forest floor. Male, heavy-set, wearing a red down jacket with a tear across the back that exposed the insulation like a wound leaking white cotton. He wasn't moving. "Fresh?" I whispered. Garrett studied the scene through the rifle scope. The blood's frozen, but not old. Maybe 48 hours. We had two options. Detour around the clearing, adding distance and time through uncharted deadfall, or pass through directly, stepping past whatever story that body represented. Garrett chose the direct road. Speed over caution. Daylight was not infinite. We edged around the body in a wide arc. As I passed within 15 feet, I could see the man's hands. Fingers dug into the soil, frozen in the act of crawling. He'd been trying to move when he died. Toward what or away from what, I couldn't determine. The tear in his jacket crossed his spine at the shoulder blades, and beneath the torn fabric, the skin was discolored in a pattern I didn't want to examine closely. Paul made a sound behind me, a sharp intake of breath that he converted into a cough. Garrett spun and fixed him with a stare that communicated more than any words could. We cleared the timber band without further incident and emerged onto the upper section of the ridge where the terrain opened again. The Vermilion adit was visible now, a dark rectangular opening in a cliff face roughly half a mile ahead, with the remains of a wooden platform and rusted ore cart tracks extending from the entrance like a tongue. The relief I felt at seeing that concrete mouth set into solid rock was physical. A loosening in my chest that I hadn't realized was constricted. Garrett picked up the pace. We covered the last half mile in 20 minutes. We did not look back at the timber band. Something in there had been watching us pass. I felt it with the animal certainty that predates language. The Vermilion adit was everything Garrett promised and nothing I'd hoped. The entrance was reinforced concrete poured around a steel frame, the kind of industrial construction that the mining companies of the 1940s built to last decades. The opening was roughly 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide. A single point of entry that could be blocked, barricaded, or defended by one person with a clear line of sight. Inside, the main tunnel extended 30 feet before splitting into 3 chambers. A larger central room where equipment had once been stored, and 2 smaller side rooms that had served as powder magazines. The walls were solid rock faced with concrete where the original stone had been unstable. The floor was compacted earth over bedrock. A ventilation shaft in the central room, maybe 8 inches in diameter, provided minimal airflow. Enough to breathe, not enough to freeze. It was cold. Mountain interior cold, a constant 42 degrees, regardless of outside temperature. The kind of cold that doesn't kill you immediately but dismantles your comfort in increments until hypothermia becomes a background process running beneath every other concern. We moved in and set up. Garrett claimed the right side of the central room, establishing his position near the entrance with the rifle across his knees. Mara and Lily took the left powder magazine. Smaller, more enclosed, warmer from the retained body heat of anyone inside it. Paul took the right magazine. I set up the camp stove in the central room and heated water for instant coffee that tasted like survival itself. Bitter, essential, the last thread connecting us to the rituals of a functioning world. "We need rules," Garrett said, once we were settled and the packs were organized. He outlined them without asking for input. Noise discipline at all times. Whispered speech only, nothing louder. No lights visible from the entrance after dark. One person on watch at the tunnel mouth at all times, 8-hour shifts divided among the 4 adults. Food rationed to 1 can per person per day, half a can for Lily. No one leaves the attic alone. All excursions for water or firewood conducted in pairs during daylight hours only. The rules were reasonable. Their delivery was not. Garrett spoke with the authority of someone who had decided that consensus was a luxury the apocalypse could not afford. And his eyes moved between us, not to gauge agreement, but to identify resistance. "I think we should discuss rationing as a group," Mara said. I just did. 1 can per day keeps us alive for 8 more days. That's the math. There are other considerations beyond caloric minimum. Lily needs to be alive. Everything else is secondary. The temperature between them dropped measurably. Mara held his gaze for 3 full seconds, an ER nurse staring down a corrections officer, and neither of them blinked. Then Mara nodded once, took Lily into the powder magazine, and closed the conversation by closing the distance between herself and her child. I followed Garrett to the entrance, where the late afternoon light was turning the ridge to amber. He stood with one hand on the concrete frame and looked out at the mountain with an expression I recognized from my own reflection in the truck's rearview mirror. It was the face of someone cataloging everything they'd lost and converting it into fuel for what remained. "You disagree with me," he said without turning. "I think you're right about the math and wrong about the method. In my experience, people who worry about method over outcomes don't survive crisis. In my experience, people who ignore method create the next crisis." He glanced at me. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement that I'd pushed back without being pushed over. In the hierarchy he was constructing, that earned me something. Not equality, something more like provisional respect. "Watch starts at 2200, he said. "You've got first shift." I took my position at the entrance that night and stared out into the darkness where the ridge met the sky. No clicking, no wailing. The infected hadn't found us yet. The word "yet" occupied my mind like a tenant who refused to pay rent. The attic held for 6 days. In that time, I learned more about human behavior under sustained threat than I had in 36 years of ordinary life. Garrett's authority calcified daily. What began as practical leadership hardened into something territorial. He controlled the food supply, literally, physically positioning himself between the canned goods and everyone else. He assigned tasks without discussion and responded to questions with answers that were actually instructions. On the 3rd day in the attic, he told Paul to go alone to a nearby stream for water, violating his own pairs-only rule. When I pointed this out, he said Paul needed to learn self-reliance. When I pressed, he reminded me that he was the one holding 60 rounds of ammunition, and that ammunition was the only thing standing between us and the darkness outside. He wasn't wrong, and that was precisely the problem. Garrett's logic was always technically correct, the kind of correctness that operates like a closing door, accurate but airless. Mara managed the situation, with the skill of someone who had spent years navigating hospital hierarchies dominated by ego and urgency. She didn't challenge Garrett directly after that first night. She operated laterally, suggesting rather than demanding, framing her medical expertise as a resource that served his objectives rather than opposed his authority. She got Lily an extra quarter can of beans per day by presenting it as a medical necessity. A child's caloric needs relative to body weight are higher than an adult's. If she loses function, she becomes dead weight we have to carry. The math favors feeding her now. Garrett accepted that. The language of efficiency was the only language that reached him. Paul deteriorated. His silence, which I'd initially attributed to shyness, revealed itself as something deeper. He sat in his powder magazine for hours without moving, the shotgun across his lap, his eyes focused on a point in the middle distance that didn't correspond to any physical object. He ate when told to. He stood watch when assigned. But his responses were increasingly delayed, his movements increasingly mechanical. And on the 5th day in the adit, I found him standing at the entrance in the middle of the night during Garrett's shift, not on watch, not doing anything, just standing at the threshold looking out into the black with the shotgun pointed at the ground and tears running silently down his face. I guided him back inside. He let me, the way a child lets a parent steer them away from something they don't understand yet. I sat with him in his magazine and waited. "My mom's in Montrose," he said finally. The first complete sentence I'd heard from him in days. "She takes pills for her blood pressure. She had maybe 2 weeks' supply when this started." The arithmetic of that statement was simple and devastating. 2 weeks from October 28th was November 11th. It was now November 10th. Whatever was happening in Montrose, whatever the infection had done to a city of 20,000 people, Paul's mother was there with 1 day of medication remaining and no son to help her. "I can't stay here," he said. "Paul, the valley." "I know what's in the valley. I know what going down means. But she's my mother, and every day I sit inside this rock, I'm choosing myself over her." I had no argument against that. Not because his plan was rational, it was suicidal, but because the moral foundation beneath it was unassailable. He was a son. She was his mother. The equation was older than civilization and immune to tactical reasoning. I told Garrett the next morning. His response was immediate and delivered without looking up from the canned peaches he was eating for breakfast. "If he goes, the shotgun stays. You can't take his only means of defense. The shotgun belongs to whoever defends this position. He's choosing to leave the position. The weapon stays." I looked at Paul. He was standing near the entrance with his pack already assembled, light, almost empty. His face held an expression of desperate peace, the kind of serenity that comes from deciding to stop deliberating and simply act. "Give me 10 shells, he said to Garrett. "Keep the rest and the gun." Garrett thought for 4 seconds. 5. Paul took the 5 shells and put them in his jacket pocket. He shook my hand. He nodded to Mara. He knelt in front of Lily and said something I couldn't hear. Then he walked out into the morning light and turned west, toward the descent and the valley, and everything waiting in it. Paul had been gone for 3 hours when we heard the shotgun. 2 blasts, separated by maybe 4 seconds. Distant, down the ridge, in or near the timber band we'd crossed on the way in. The sound carried across the mountain with hideous clarity, echoing off the rock walls of the valley below and returning to us in overlapping waves that made it impossible to determine exactly how far away the shots originated. Then a 3rd blast. Then silence. 2 shells remaining. If he was still alive. Mara closed her eyes. Garrett walked to the entrance and listened, his body taut with the particular tension of a man calculating whether another man's disaster is approaching his perimeter. If those shots drew them toward his position, that's attention pulled away from us, he said. I don't think he meant it as callously as it sounded. I think he was narrating his own strategic reasoning aloud, because the alternative was acknowledging that a 25-year-old kid he'd led into the mountains was probably dying right now, because Garrett had sent him to the stream alone and broken his own rules and cracked the psychological armor that Paul needed to stay put. But I don't know that. I never will. We heard nothing else from Paul's direction. The mountain absorbed the shotgun blasts and returned to its silence, and Paul Devon became another absence in a landscape increasingly defined by them. That night, the infected found the adit. I was on watch, midnight to 4 a.m., and I smelled them before I saw them. That iron and vinegar scent, carried on a shift in the wind. I pressed myself against the concrete wall just inside the entrance and peered out. They were on the ridge, a column of them, moving single file along the game path we'd used, traveling northeast. The moonlight showed me at least 20 figures, possibly more where the path curved beyond my sight line. They moved with a fluidity I hadn't seen before, none of the stumbling or lurching from the earlier encounters. Their gait was smooth and purposeful, knees bending properly, arms swinging in rhythm. Whatever motor function degradation Mara had observed at altitude was gone. They had adapted completely. The column passed the adit entrance at a distance of approximately 40 yards. I stopped breathing. I pressed my back against concrete and rock and willed my heartbeat to slow through sheer force of refusal. They didn't stop. They continued northeast, following the ridge toward whatever destination their collective navigation had identified. 23 figures passed my position in roughly 4 minutes. I counted every one. The 24th stopped. It stood on the path directly across from the adit entrance and turned its head toward the opening. I couldn't see features in the moonlight, just a silhouette. Human-shaped but held with an unnatural stillness, the kind of absolute motionlessness that living bodies can't achieve, because living bodies are always breathing, always shifting weight, always adjusting. This figure didn't adjust. It stood like a photograph of a person, and it faced the dark mouth of the adit where I stood pressed against the wall with my hand over my own mouth. 10 seconds. 20, 30. The figure tilted its head. That same angle I'd seen on the first night, the orange vest man in my clearing, chin dropped toward the shoulder, the posture of a predator triangulating a sound source. Had I made a sound? Had my breathing been audible? Had my heartbeat, absurdly, irrationally, carried through the concrete and air and reached those repurposed ears? The figure took one step toward the adit, then another. From behind me in the darkness, Garrett's hand closed around my forearm with crushing pressure. In my ear, so close I could feel his beard against my skin. He whispered a single word. Still. The figure took a third step. It was now 20 yards from the entrance, close enough that I could see its hands in the moonlight. Fingers extended, rigid. That same electrical spread I'd seen on the first infected visitor to the cabin. Then the column's clicking resumed from ahead on the ridge, a rapid summoning pattern. And the figure turned away. It rejoined the column. The group continued northeast and disappeared beyond the curve of the ridge. Garrett released my arm. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold earth floor with my knees against my chest. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the night. The conversation happened the next morning, and it was the most honest exchange I've had with another human being in my life. Mara initiated it. She sat between Garrett and me in the central chamber with Lily sleeping in the powder magazine. Behind a blanket hung across the entrance, and she spoke with the controlled precision of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. We have 4 days of food. The water source requires a 40-minute round trip through exposed terrain. There are now columns of infected traveling the ridge at night. Paul is gone, and so is the shotgun. We have 1 rifle with 53 remaining rounds. We have 1 child who has not spoken in 17 days. We cannot stay here. Garrett didn't argue. The absence of his usual resistance was more alarming than anything outside the adit. "Where?" he said. Mara had been thinking about this. While Garrett controlled the food and I maintained the watch schedule and Paul dissolved into his grief, Mara had been thinking. The radio broadcast from Farmington had mentioned military containment operations near Pueblo. Pueblo was northeast, roughly 200 miles through mountain terrain that would take weeks on foot, but might be reachable if we could descend to a road and find a vehicle. The alternative was continuing south toward the FEMA staging areas mentioned in the earlier broadcast. But that meant descending through the infected valleys. "Northeast," she said. We drop off the ridge into the Animas drainage, follow the river valley north toward Silverton, then cut east toward the highway. "The river valley will be crawling with them," I said. "Probably. But water sources are also where we'll find abandoned vehicles, structures, supplies. The ridge is sterile. The valley is dangerous but resourceful. We trade safety for capability." Garrett looked at her for a long time. I watched him perform a calculation I'd seen before, the one where he weighed another person's competence against his need to be the source of all decisions. Mara met his gaze with the same unflinching steadiness she'd shown on the first night. "You've been thinking about this since we got here," he said. "Since before that, since the cabin. Why didn't you say something earlier?" "Because earlier, this position was defensible, and the food was sufficient. Now neither is true. I present information when it's actionable, not when it's theoretical." Garrett almost smiled. It was the closest thing to respect I'd seen him offer anyone. "We leave tomorrow at first light," he said. "Pack tonight, sleep in shifts, move fast at dawn." That final night in the adit was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as though the mountain had chosen to give us one last interval of peace before the next phase. I sat my watch at the entrance and stared at the stars, dense and sharp at this altitude. The Milky Way arcing overhead like a wound in the sky leaking light. I thought about Karen, not with bitterness, with something closer to archaeological curiosity, sifting through the remains of a life that felt as distant as the civilization producing those stars' light. She'd wanted stability. I'd wanted meaning. Neither of us was wrong. We were just solving different equations in the same room. I thought about Paul, walking down that ridge with 5 shells and a destination he probably knew he'd never reach. There's a particular kind of courage that looks identical to surrender, and I've never been able to determine which one Paul was carrying in his pockets alongside those shells. I thought about Lily, the way she'd pointed at the pica on the ridge traverse, the way her finger had held steady, selecting one small living thing from a landscape of death and claiming it with her attention. If there was a thesis to this experience, if any of this could be compressed into a lesson that a history teacher might one day write on a board for students who would never believe it, it was in that gesture. The refusal to stop noticing, the insistence on pointing at life even when everything surrounding it was its opposite. Dawn came. We packed. We moved. The descent began. We reached the river valley on November 14th. It was everything Mara predicted. Dangerous, populated with things that had once been people, and stocked with the resources that those people had left behind. We found a truck with half a tank of gas in an abandoned campground. Garrett drove, Mara navigated. I sat in the bed with the rifle and watched the tree line and the road behind us for movement. Lily spoke her first word on November 16th, somewhere east of Lake City on a dirt road that cut through a mountain pass I didn't know the name of. She said, "Hungry." One word. Mara fed her a can of peaches, and the girl ate every piece with her fingers and licked the syrup from her palm. I never found out what happened to Paul. I never returned to Uncle Ray's cabin. I never reconciled with Karen or went back to teaching. Some mornings, I still wake before dawn and listen, not for the clicking or the wailing, for the silence that used to mean safety and now means something is choosing not to make a sound. I listen and I wait. And I don't go back to sleep until the sun rises and the birds begin, one by one, to argue with the darkness. This is your new channel. Here you'll get to hear brand new stories regularly. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and click the bell button. Thank you.